Our first board-sponsored CU event. So whether this is your first alumni event you've come to or you've been coming to our events for a while now, we're very thrilled that you're all able to be here with us tonight. We know you probably have a lot of other places where you can be, but you've chosen to be here, so we really appreciate you being here tonight. It's really great to see alumni stay connected to the college or re-engage with the college after you graduate and move on to, other things. In the college, as myself and fellow board members would say, we are proud, to be graduates of this college. So it's great to stay connected. And I think it's my understanding that we have a good student turnout tonight too. So thanks a lot, students, for coming. Whether you kind of been forced by maybe one of your professors sitting up here, or by your field instructor, in my case, we're glad that you're here. So at this time, I'm going to go ahead and introduce the board. As you guys see on your agendas here, this event tonight is sponsored by the Jane Addams Alumni Board in conjunction with the college, and we received a small grant from the UIC Institute for Policy and Civic Engagement. So they helped supply the yummy tapas and the beverages that you were having on your way in. So let me go ahead and introduce our board. I'm going to start with Jody. Jody's one of our board members. Ken, where's Ken? Ken, he acts as the liaison to Illinois Connection, which is an advocacy organization. Judy Rocha, she's our secretary. Miller Anderson, oh, right there, who's gonna join up here and act as our moderator for this evening's panel. And then Joel Rubin, who's our board treasurer and will also act as a panelist tonight. And I don't want to forget to thank Evelina. Where's Evelina? Evelina is a development coordinator and acts as a liaison between the Jane Addams College and the Alumni Board. And so she handled a lot of the little details tonight. And so thank you so much, Evelina, for pulling this together for us tonight. So without Evelina, this wouldn't have happened. But of course, without none of this would be possible without our fearless and awesome, awesome dean. Who is celebrating her 21st year here as Dean of the College. Yeah. So Dean Creasy Finney-Harrison, want to address the audience real quick? Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. After being introduced and noted as being fearless and awesome, I cannot get here and act nervous. But it is a pleasure to see all of you and always to have alumni back to the college. When I look across the room, or I guess I should be saying the auditorium, I see so many familiar faces, and I've been like waving, hey, But it's really good to have you here. And then I'm waving to somebody on upper berth now that I haven't seen for a while. But it's also good to see new faces. You're not new to Jane Addams, but either you've changed a lot and I don't recognize you, or you really are new to me. So it's just good for all of us to be here. Tonight, we're talking about a really exciting topic, and I'm delighted to have my colleague, and I shouldn't be introducing the panel, but we do have a national expert and a person who really does know Chicago politics and national politics very well, and then an esteemed panel to discuss these issues. So I'm going to say thank you very much before you even speak, for coming here to work with us. This has been quite an election year. I must say that I went to vote 4 different times. I was determined that I was going to vote. The first time I went to vote, I could not do so because our president was voting that morning, and they had everything curtained off. I went the next day, the third day, and finally the 4th day, and you wonder, well, why couldn't I vote? It was because there were so many other people who were voting, and there was no place for me to park. But I think at that time I thought that my vote would make a difference. And so I was determined to do that and call all my relatives and friends and told them they'd better go vote too, because there was a lot at stake in this election, no matter who won the election. So tonight we're going to be doing post-election discussions. I said to our panel earlier, pontifications, but we're going to be discussing that in a very meaningful way. So again, thank you all for being here to be a part of this, and I hope that all of us leave with a tidbit of knowledge and wisdom that we can use in our day-to-day work. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Dean. And I was very rude. I forgot to introduce myself. I'm Nicole Milano, Jane Addams alum from 01, and I'm the president of the board. So a couple logistics. Obviously, if we can turn off the cell phones or put them on vibrate to not disturb the presentation. Restrooms are right outside. As you probably know, you're not supposed to have food or drink inside this room here. And you all were given, actually, let me talk about this. Somebody, I think, dropped a parking pass. So if you want to just double check, and if you don't have your parking ticket, you might want to grab this one because you don't want to get charged. The other thing we had at the registration table was kind of a fish bowl, which we're going to give away a couple little goodies at the end of the presentation. If you want to drop a business card or just fill in your contact, your name, and put it in the fish bowl, we're going to draw names at the end. The other thing is, if you were given index cards when you walked in, we're going to try to make this panel discussion as interactive as we can. And so this is to write down questions as the speakers are presenting. So if you come up with a question while someone's speaking, go ahead and write that question down on your index card. When that presenter is finished speaking, if you can just, like, in between the transition of the speakers, just maybe like raise your hand, and myself or Judy will be walking kind of up and down the aisles, and we'll collect the cards from you. And then we'll address the questions at the end. What else? Drawing index cards. That's it. So I think without delaying, I'll go ahead and briefly introduce our panelists. I'm just going to go in order, and then I'll turn it over to Miller, the moderator, who will give us a little bit more logistics on how this is going to work. Dr. Mark Matini. He's an associate professor here at Jane Addams, a distinguished career in nonviolence, social action, and violence prevention. Excuse me. He has shaped the community health and urban development concentration here. Mr. Joel Rubin, like I mentioned earlier, the treasurer of our board. He's the executive director of the Illinois chapter of the National Association of Social Workers, a position which he's held since 1999. So that's awesome, Joel. Kathy, I forgot to ask you how to say your name.
Wallagora.
Wallagora. Thank you very much, Kathy. She's the Policy and Communications Coordinator at the Illinois Maternal and Child Health Coalition, and she's very knowledgeable on the Affordable Care Act, and so I'm really excited to have her here. Professor Von Nebbit. He's an associate professor here at Jane Addams. He has over 10 years of experience as a researcher and educator, as a social work practitioner. And then at the end, of course, distinguished Professor Dick Simpson, who's the professor and department head of the Department of Political Science here at UIC, among a slew of other things. And that's why we left you guys with a bio for everybody, so you can read them at your leisure. But we're really excited here to have a wealth of knowledge and expertise for you today. So without further ado, I'll turn over to Miller Anderson, who's our moderator for the evening. Miller?
I'll go to my chair. You all can hear me, right? I don't need a microphone in this wonderful room. Basically, what we're going to do in terms of logistics, we have so much information at the table that we're going to try to condense it to within an hour and a half or so format. And so Dick Simpson will be our keynote. We'll provide an overview, and then we're going to actually go in the order in which our presenters are listed on our agenda, to basically have 10 minutes or so to basically respond and also add their insights as well. As Nicole said, we will be collecting questions. We have our crack team of question collectors who will do them in between speakers so we don't interrupt the presentations. And then what we'll do After we have collected the questions, and this should probably take about, a good hour, hour and a half, then we will go through and sort some of the questions and give them an opportunity to further enhance or embellish some issues that may come from the audience. And so, without any further ado, we may as well get the show on the road, and I'm going to kind of slide back and let Professor Simpson kind of kick this off. So, welcome, and again, I want to thank everyone here, and I'm glad, speaking of logistics, we did work our logistics through on Monday, and I would be remiss also in that Jody is here to be our timekeeper, because we know once everybody gets rolling, we want to keep things on track. So she will have the flashcards. This is not for you, Professor Simpson.
That's all right. We had a 10-minute time limit in the city council, and I didn't usually turn on my mic anyway. So
she will be our go-to person to just keep us on point and going. So without further ado, Professor Simpson.
Thank you. Glad to be here. As you know, the 2012 election was an election of both continuity and change. It wasn't a great change election, as what we in political science call critical realigning elections, in that it wasn't like the New Deal election, in which once the parties switched in majorities, it was a matter for generations, so that for the next 30, 40 years, the Democrats had been the minority for a very long time, essentially since the Civil War. After 1932, they held the post of president, controlled the Congress for many of the next decades. And it's because people changed their party identity. They didn't just vote in the election, it actually affected their life. And this election was not that big a change. It was more what was called, might be called a wave election. The last wave election was very recent. It was in 2010. That's when the Republican wave rolled in. And the Republican wave rolled in because of the confluence of the Tea Party growing up and getting a grounding, and so many people were so dissatisfied with what was happening in the recession. And they blamed the party in power, which was the Democrats at that time. This time, the wave rolled back out. It's just like the ocean coming in and going out. The Republicans were left on the dry land this time. The Democrats were the ones with most offices. So who were the winners and losers? That's pretty clear. I mean, obviously, as you know, Barack Obama was reelected. Barack Obama won not only the electoral vote, technically winning the election, but he won the popular vote. In addition, Democrats gained seats in the U.S. Senate, even though they had more than twice as many seats at jeopardy in terms of the number of people who were Democrats or Republicans running for re-election. So they now control the Senate by 55 to 45. On the other side of the aisle, the Democrats gained a number of seats in the House, but the Republicans still, by a very safe majority, control the House of Representatives. Now, why did they win or they lose? Nationally, the Republicans won the white male vote, but not by a huge margin, and the Democrats won the female vote. And that was very significant, so sometimes called the gender gap in voting. But more importantly, perhaps, even than that, was the minority vote. The minority vote of Latinos and blacks and others was 80% in favor of Obama, only 18% in favor of the Republicans. So that's not a minor difference. And these are not anymore very smaller groups. Before I want to go on to the youth in just a second, let me tell you a little more about the white vote, which was interesting. 7 million fewer whites voted in the 2012 election than did in 2008. And we don't really know entirely why that is yet, but this is what we suspect. We suspect some of the white voters were unhappy with Obama. They were still upset with the recession. They didn't like something he did or something that was said. But on the other hand, they believed either the Obama ads or what Romney himself had said and didn't want to vote for him either, so they stayed home. Now, the other major group that was different in this election, or much more significant in this election, was the Latino vote. The Latino vote was particularly important in the battleground states. And one reason that that's so especially important is that Latinos are a younger population. There are lots of people under 18 who are Latino. They're going to turn 18. They're going to be eligible to vote. There are lots of Latinos who are waiting to be naturalized and become citizens. They're in the pipeline somewhere. They will be voting, or many more of them will. So the Latino vote's going to continue to grow. Now in Chicago, that doesn't take us by much surprise if you've been paying attention. Latinos are a third of the population. But in much of the country, it was sort of a surprise. Oh, there are Latinos here? Well, we hadn't particularly paid attention. And sure enough, there are. And more than that, this time they voted. And unlike previous elections, say the George W. Bush election, in which he was able to get 40% of the Latino vote, the Latino vote was just as almost as lopsided voting for Obama as, say, the African-American vote. Not quite, but substantially. And it's likely the Latino vote may be lost forever if the Republicans don't change policy, and I'm going to come to that in just a second. One of the things that wasn't very well reported was how important the youth vote was. The youth vote is almost exactly the same in percentages as it was in the 2008 election. Not huge, it was 51% in the 2008 election, it's 49% in this election. But when it dropped to 24% in 2010 was when the Republicans won. The youth vote is a very significant swing vote, and for those of you that are students and might still be in the category, which I am not anymore, of the youth vote, it's become a very significant component, and it matters because once you begin to vote for a particular party, it's not just a candidate, once you begin to have a party identity, which many people acquire in college or at about that time in life, that may last for a long, long time, and that long time means 40, 50 years of voting, not just one election. Now, this is also the year of the woman in a way that you might not have heard reported in the media. We had the most women elected to the U.S. Congress in the history of the United States. 20 women will be serving in the U.S. Senate. I can remember when there was only one. There will be 78 in the House of Representatives. Yes, give yourself a hand. Now in Illinois, we played a part in the change, in what might be the wave, and a big one, particularly at the congressional level. And it has particular significance. Republicans lost 4 seats, congressional seats in the state of Illinois. So it almost flipped the congressional delegation. There are now going to be 12 Democrats and 6 Republicans in the new congressional delegation from Illinois. But where did they come from? 3 of those seats are from the suburban ring around Chicago. They were Tammy Duckworth, Brad Schneider, and Bill Foster. And what that signals is before some of those districts had been once won by Democrat, and then the Republicans came back in 2010. Now it's gone back to the Democrats. But it also meant that there were elections in places like DuPage County where state legislators who were Democrats won. There were some of the further out counties where county board members who were Democrats won. The suburbs are no longer an automatic safe haven for the Republicans. And that changes the balance of power in Illinois politics in a way that has a longer effect. In the immediate term, the state legislature, for instance, the Democrats won a veto-proof majority. You probably won't need to remember all the numbers, but it was 40-19 in the Senate and 71-47 in the House. So what that means is the Democrats now have the power. They have the governor and they have the 2 houses of Congress, and not by just a small majority. It means if they choose to, the Democrats can make any law they want to. And 2 laws are very important. And I'm sure we'll get into this if we talk about state politics. The 2 most important are to make the temporary state income tax permanent. The reason for that has to be that if it's not done, by 2014 we lose the increase in the income tax that was just passed, and within 10 years we are back into double-digit billion-dollar deficits, which means, particularly for those who care about social services, there ain't going to be any. We will not be able to afford it. That's beyond the second issue I'm going to raise. So just an operating budget, things got better in the state. I mean, you may not see it because a lot of cuts were happening. But if you think about the fiscal cliff in Washington, the fiscal cliff in the state is if we do not maintain at least some reasonable level of spending, not go into a big spending mode, and don't keep the income tax, there will be no social programs because it won't be able to be afforded. Second big issue is the pension reforms, and very likely what will happen in the pension reforms will be at least the school districts and probably our university will begin to have to pay employee pensions. It gets complicated. If you really want to take all evening, we can talk about the details of the pension, so-called pension reform, pension change in any case. But the Democrats now have the votes to do it. Whether or not suburban Republicans like it, whether or not individuals like it, whether as an employee I like it, they'd have the votes, and my prediction is something will be done on both making permanent the income tax, presuming that the state legislators can read numbers. I don't care if they can read words, if they can just get the numbers straight. And there will be something done about the pension. Now, there were some negative aspects of the election, if what I haven't said is not seen as negative already. One of the things in this election that happened is all judges were reelected, or technically retained. That's despite the unanimous recommendation of all the bar associations and the major media, particularly the Chicago Tribune, that almost unanimously recommended 6 judges who should not be on the bench. No justice, no judge has been defeated, no matter how incompetent they are, for 20 years. This is not only a broke system, this is a totally broken system. In terms of the further down the ballot, although this is actually a little higher than that, the constitutional amendment to require 60% legislative vote to change the pension benefits, particularly to raise them, was defeated. And what was not as much noticed is the referendum that was non-binding in 35 wards in Chicago to have an elected school board received 86% support. Whether everybody really wants an elected school board or they just want to send a message about the school situation and about having a voice in it, I think that's a meaningful referendum. Now, there was another important aspect of this election at every level, and that is that while a lot of money, way too much, is needed in elections, money doesn't win all the time. If you look at the outside PACs or outside interest groups, the campaigns to which they gave funds didn't always win, and of course all their money was mostly spent on negative ads, sometimes on a little else, but that was most of it, which made this a much more negative election than most. In the 15 U.S. Senate races with $5 million or more by independent groups, only 7 were won by the candidates favored by the more spending. 8 were won by those who got less spending by the outside groups. And in the 40 House races of $2 million or more, which I can tell you is a lot on a House race, 17 were won by those favored by the outside groups, 23 by the less favored. So money matters. If you can have it, that's a great thing in an election, but it doesn't carry the day. Now, down to the final meaning of the election in many different senses, and the panelists will talk more about some of the specifics. So I should say one side note about the youth that voted. Social media also played a much bigger role. 55% of the registered voters got at least some of their political information online during the campaign. Almost the same percentage watched videos. YouTube streamed the debates live, and 24 million people watched those. 11 million tweeted about the second debate. 31 million tweeted on Election Day, urging, like the dean was saying to her relatives, instead of making a phone call to them, many people tweeted their friends and relatives that you better get out to the polls, it matters. And of course the disparity between the Obama campaign and the Romney campaign was vastly in favor of the Obama campaign and the use of social media, although the Republicans are catching up and beginning to understand the use of the social media. Now to my final conclusion. Republicans, of course, shouldn't be counted out. They are still a very significant and important part of American politics. They have a significant role of government. And even if this wave or tide was against them, tide last election was the Democrats and they came back, they are not gone. But if they're going to be effective in the long haul, they have to find a way to appeal to minorities and women and youth. They can't continue to ignore these segments, or not connect with them anyway, and win most elections. The Democrats, on the other hand, have a major responsibility. They have to show with their new numbers in Washington and their overwhelming majorities in Springfield that they can solve the major problems of the country and in Illinois, or this truly will be a wave election and the Democrats will not win necessarily the next time around.
Thank you, Professor. That was very enlightening. So I've got some new insight already, so thank you, especially the youth voting and the tweeting, because I know my son, show my age is 29, and they were doing a lot of tweeting back and forth on the election. So It's a powerful medium. Mark, we want to let you go next and kind of show your words of wisdom.
I tweeted during all three of the debates, as it happens. So we had an election. And there are reasons for some modest celebration. Many more people will get adequate health care than might have happened had it gone the other way nationally, although at elevated cost because we've got the entire corporate insurance structure in the middle there. And there'll be more jobs for social workers as a result of ACA, and that's clear. And one of our other panelists will probably have a lot more detail about that. So we get some protection for women's health, some protection for the elderly in terms of Social Security, Medicare, although the current structure really isn't sustainable long term, so we're going to have to keep revisiting that over and over. But despite all that, there's reason, I think, to be deeply troubled. My question is, where is the political space to address the gravest issues that we face? Among industrialized nations, we have the highest poverty rate. We have the lowest government spending in terms of percentage of GDP on social programs for the disadvantaged. We have the highest homicide rate, the largest per capita prison population. We have the greatest national income disparities in the world, and the global income disparities are horrifying. There's still there are a billion people who live on less than $2 a day in the world. These issues have profound implications, I think, for social stability, for the future of democracy. There are unacknowledged and unprecedented levels of structural violence in the world at this time, domestically and internationally, what Paul Farmer has called pathologies of power that sustain privilege for the few and destroy the lives of the most vulnerable. I highly recommend, if you have not read it, that you take a look at Chris Hedges' book, Days of Destruction, Days of Revolt. It's beautifully written, and your parents can understand it as well, which I think is really important. He talks about the undocumented and third world labor, and among those who are most left out. He talks about mining communities, fracking, all of those kinds of issues. He talks about the worst of the Indian reservations. Now, some of the reservations are not bad. Where my spouse lives on Laguna Pueblo, people do pretty well. But that's not Pine Ridge. That's not Rosebud. African-American young men. African-American young men locally, nationally certainly, but locally, just a profound disaster, ongoing disaster. The school to prison pipeline, horrifying. In Chicago, we have a 60% high school graduation rate. There are a number of schools that have a 50% graduation rate. For African-American young men, it's much lower than that in the worst of the schools, of course. And this is all easily available on the web. Now, so far the things I'm talking about, there was no discussion of in the election, at any level. All right. It doesn't get better, I have to say. We have neighborhoods in Chicago where people live under the constant threat and fear of violence. And this has profound and long-lasting health, mental health, physical health, social and economic implications for the city. The so-called Mexican drug cartels are now involved, the police department tells us, in drug sales in Chicago. I was in Medellin, which you may call Medellin, but they actually pronounce it Medellin, in Colombia 2 years ago at this time, over Thanksgiving. The police in the worst of the comunas in Medellin are doing better than the police in Chicago in terms of managing community violence. In fact, I met with a group of young police officers there, and they offered to come to Chicago to tell the Chicago police how to do it right. And they actually did much better than what we're doing here. Finally, and this is not going to make it simpler, all of the above are causally connected in one way or another with a shared ideology of unconstrained global corporate capitalism that relies on a narrative of endless growth, both in population and in consumption. It's an enormous Ponzi scheme. It's not, endless growth cannot be sustained in a limited world. Even climate change. We may think climate change is a big problem, but climate change is actually one of the effects of growth. We can't control climate change by itself. So I turn the page, and I ask again, where is the political space to address these most serious issues that we face? None of the things I've talked about, except a little bit of what kind of guns kill kids on the Chicago streets. That Obama brought that up at one moment. But other than that, really, the things I'm talking about were not addressed in this election. I suspect that the only way to open that political space would be through the emergence of a new progressive movement. Now, I do teach social welfare history, but you're all social workers, so you had enough social welfare history to know about the progressive movement at the turn of the last century. I don't think that the Occupy movement is going to do it. The Occupy movement may have been stronger had Romney won, actually. I think the chances that it's going to kind of fade are pretty good at this point. But on the other hand, the Occupy movement did teach a bunch of people a bunch of skills. So there may be something we can draw from that, but that's not going to be enough. Perhaps what we need is a new, old coalition that dates back to Jane Addams. Who is in that coalition? Activists, social workers, public health allies, journalists, artists. Social work needs to be part of a new progressive movement if those issues that I have raised are going to find their way into the political process at all, I think. Maybe a Green Party. And the Green Party got half of 1% of the vote, I believe, in the presidential election in Illinois, despite the fact that Obama won by something like 17%. There was room for 5% to vote Green there. But I and a couple of you may be the only ones that did. The really huge challenge, I think, is what is it going to take to move the political process to pay attention to these issues? And I suspect that, like happened in the New Deal, it's going to require that things get bad enough that we have social and economic instability in the country and around the world. And many of these things, the problem, of course, with globalization, among other things, is that these issues become global issues as well. So income disparities are not just in Chicago, not just in Illinois, not just in the US, but international, global disparities are going to have a profound impact. Why do people in so many places not like us? It's because everything we do is globalized at this point. That's what I have to say. The question I leave you with is, where is the political space going to open to address these truly grave human issues? Thank you.
Professor Nesbitt.
Oh, me?
Yes.
Okay. Hello? Thanks, Mark. I kind of saw it a little bit. We have lots of challenges, I saw it a little bit differently. I guess I'm somewhat of a hope fiend and an optimist, and so I kind of see things through the way I see the world, like around basic needs, people's basic needs, housing, food, and that's kind of how and I know the other issues are important, but those are, for me, if an administrator is kind of attending to those basic needs, I think that's for me, that's a check. And I came into social work in housing, public housing. I worked in public housing for many years in St. Louis when I was in school, and I worked in housing during the Clinton administration, who was very pro-housing, like really magnificent things done around housing, affordable housing, public housing, and then we lost the election in 2000, and I lived through the Bush years, who was absolutely against housing. Just our housing programs, just the plug was pulled on our housing programs. And we also saw a lot of laws passed, power given to local housing authorities to pass kind of what I call draconian laws about people getting into housing. Like the qualifications to get into housing, it became ridiculous. You know, if you had been convicted, you couldn't get public housing, and there was just a lot of policies passed that that I thought complicated things even more at a time when we probably didn't need those complications, because we know for recidivism, we know that if ex-con comes home and he doesn't get employed, he or she doesn't get employed, it's probably 3 times more likely they're gonna reoffend. If they come home and they live in a shelter, it's 8 times more likely that they're gonna reoffend. And so under the Obama administration, and which I hope continue to go forward in this new administration, we've seen a change in philosophy around housing, eligibility for housing, and open access to housing, particularly for people who I think without access to safe housing are probably going to either return to prison or find themselves homeless, and we know what happened when people become homeless. Everything else kind of opens the floodgate for substance abuse, mental health problems, sexual exploitation, you name it. It's just you guys probably already know kind of the things that go along with people becoming homeless. So for me, that's when I looked at it, that's kind of how I thought about it. Is we went through those 10 years of just really awful housing policy and awful housing laws, and then for the first time, I actually saw, I do housing research and housing stuff. I actually began to see HUD putting things on their website. They had this announcement used to come out in the 90s under Clinton called Supernova, and it was funds announcements for funds available. In 2000, we just didn't see anything come across a NOFA. Like it was almost just non-existing. They pulled the plug on any kind of money to understand how housing matters to families, how housing impact people was nothing. And then we started seeing that reemerge after the Obama administration. With his appointment with Donovan, was the first time that the actual Secretary of Health and Human Services and the Secretary of HUD, met and talked. I do housing stuff. I go out to D.C. and we have these meetings, and they're at the tables talking. This is something seemed like a no-brainer if you think about. HUD provide low-income housing, public housing, to very vulnerable populations of people with many social and health needs, but the two agencies had Health and Human Services and Housing had never really got together. But now they have, under this administration. So, which kind of, for me as a housing person, is a glimmer of hope. We've also seen the Obama administration begin to invest more money into housing, particularly local housing authorities. Secretary Donovan actually wrote a letter to the housing authorities, pretty much stating Obama's position on eligibility for housing, saying that the administration, it's still a choice the choice to to let a person in public housing with a criminal background is the decision of the local housing authority. But Donovan and Obama took a very straight position that they do not support that position anymore. And so a lot of local housing authorities who really didn't want to do that in the first place, because this is the only time in history we saw a mass amount of women go to prison. And when women come home from prison, they need housing. A lot of times their family is still living in the housing development that they went to prison from, and they can't even go back to the housing development. And so this was, in my mind, I think about housing, and I think about those basic needs that people must have in order to obtain the higher needs that we all want. And for me, it was very optimistic to see that, because I know, or I hope, that the policies that were initiated in the first administration around housing reform, particularly it's an act, Transformative Rental Assistance Act, put about $4 billion back into housing, much of it going into public housing. And also, the act opened up lines of credit for housing authorities and also private renters or private renters who rent to low-income people, opened up another line of credit beyond what the federal government provides to housing authorities. So it opened a ton of money for these, agencies that provide what I think is a critical need for all people. I don't know about you, but I couldn't imagine life without a house. I don't know about you. I get tired. The first thing I say, I'm ready to go home, right? Imagine if you have no home to go to, or if you just went to prison. You had a home while you was in prison, legislation changed, and you came home, and you had no home to go to, and you have to go to a shelter, and your family may still live in public housing, but because of you now have a conviction, you can't go to public housing. And so I thought about the election in that way, that there was a set of policies in place and relationships built across agencies, federal agencies that we hadn't really seen much before the Obama administration. Most agencies, they operated in their own little houses. They just didn't talk to each other, despite how important what they did impacted people's life, like one person's life. Housing, health and human services, substance abuse, it impacts one person's life, but they didn't talk to each other. And for the first time, I was in D.C. once, I guess about 6 months ago. We had a conference was sponsored by the MacArthur Foundation on how housing matters, and they kind of just got all the people to come together, and it was really, the panel was really impressive, because we had all these agencies that provide these services to the same population actually on the stage talking and actually telling us projects that they're working on together, which I thought was revolutionary, because it hadn't happened before. And so for me, I know we have many, many challenges. This is not to undermine the many, many challenges that we still face as a result of cumulative years of what I like to call exploitation and inequalities and kind of free market capitalism, which I think has a profound effect on not just this society but the world. I think there are glimmers of hope, with the around housing, which I think is critical with the administration. So I was profoundly happy because I voted for that guy, and I like to I like for the person I vote for to win. So I was pretty happy around that. But more so because I thought that maybe some of the initiatives that kind of took place under the Clinton administration can start back up. I'm not a Chicagoan, but I do see what started under the Clinton administration is still unfinished here, with the humongous lots that you guys had that were once public housing developments. According to Hope 6, those should have been mixed income and growth communities by now. But under the Bush administration, no money. A few other cities were able to move forward because they didn't have the type of housing stock that Chicago had. And so you had the same thing happen in smaller cities where when the money was pulled, the cities were still able to actually do the Hope 6 project through block grants and state money, but they were kind of smaller housing authority, something at the scale of what Chicago had. It would really take a massive government effort and a massive government investment to kind of rebuild those communities and kind of build a type of community that we see that we hear when the Obama administration talks about communities. They talk about integrated communities, no isolated poverty communities. They talk about agencies who serve people in housing working together. And so for me, that's kind of why I think it's important that he won, and that as social workers that we need to be in the forefront, making sure that we are working with families to make sure that this very, very basic need is met. Because I think if a person just don't have a place to call home or go home to, you're going to have trouble probably trying to get them not to get high. Because if I was homeless, I would probably want to drink.
If you connect the dots, I mean, there is some synergy among all of the presentations, because it is all interlinked. And so I think even going forward now, if one did want to drink, and I would agree, one might drink too much and therefore will be in need of some type of health and medical treatment for those issues. And so, now that we know that Obamacare, as it's affectionately known, will probably not be appealed, at least today, Kathy, we're going to let you talk about that, and also your beyond Obamacare issues that you see in terms of medical impact.
So I am here to speak on healthcare, but I'd like to start by saying personally, as a member of 2 key voting blocs, women and young people, just in case you were wondering, I thought that there was a lot more to this election, and there are a lot of big issues, and I was really happy about this election, not because of the outcome, but because for the first time, I really felt like the conversation was about me, and it was about the things that I cared about, and I saw that reflected amongst my peers. And what made me so happy about that was because the conversation was finally about those things we cared about. My peers finally got involved. I'm that girl, when I was 13, I got into a screaming match with my mom because I couldn't vote in the 2000 election. It was somehow her fault. And I finally I feel more and more, I should say, each year that my friends, my peers, the people I know, aren't just voting, but they're paying attention. And I think it started with the 2008 election. It really took off with the Occupy movement, and I think we're going to see it continue to go. And what's great about that is it means that the things that matter to us get some recognition, right? So as a woman, we heard the word rape too many times, but every time we heard the word rape, it led to a conversation of birth control and reproductive access. And that doesn't just affect the elections, but we see, I think just yesterday, the UN for the first time listed birth control and access to family planning care as a basic human right. So it matters, and it was I was really happy as someone amongst those 2 groups to see the conversation taking that direction. So now, switching from my personal life to my social worker and advocate and professional role, this was a really good election for healthcare. And what's so important about this is that really the implications of this election moving forward are just that we have to continue to defend good policy, and we have to really make sure that we're defending those populations, those most vulnerable populations, and ensuring that the problems we still do have aren't affecting them and continuing to affect them in the way that they have, especially when we're talking about budget and fiscal concerns. Really, we had 2 options during the election, right? We had, when it comes to the presidential election at least, we had Mitt Romney, who wanted a radical departure from the trajectory we've been on. He proposed a lot of things around repealing Obamacare, but also turning Medicare into a voucher, block granting Medicaid. Or we had President Obama, whose campaign really was, let's keep moving. We've done a lot of good work in the last 4 years, and we just don't want to reverse that. So it's pretty easy to talk about the implications for health care post-election, because they're just continuing. At this point, it really becomes a lot about implication, outreach, and obviously, to a great degree, defense, particularly in these fiscal conversations. So when we talk about the Affordable Care Act, it's important to remember that context around which this law was written, right? If we forget that context, then this implementation becomes meaningless. So we were looking to solve the problem of uninsured. 1 in 7 people in our country was uninsured at the time the law was signed in 2010. Cost was outrageous. The cost of health care is ever increasing, but the access to health care is ever decreasing. We have severe shortages of physicians in our country. We have all those uninsured people who aren't able to access care, and we have the ever continuous chipping away at Medicaid specifically. So what did this law do? I mean, we've got when it comes to the problem of cost, we've got tax credits and subsidies to help people pay for care. We've got the expansion of Medicaid. When it comes to access, we've got the creation of competitive health insurance exchanges, hopefully. We've got the extended dependent coverage. We've got support for primary care physicians, which bleeds out into support for people we didn't really recognize as healthcare providers before, right? We've got nurses, we've got physician's assistants. Most importantly, we've got social workers, for the first time ever being recognized as people who provide some sort of primary care. You know, we also went to the industry reforms, right? We've got rate review changes, medical loss ratio. These things are designed to keep costs down. We've got denials for pre-existing conditions, gender rating, which is the practice of charging women significantly more for the same health care. That's going to become illegal. We've got the establishment of essential health benefits, which provide a standard, a minimum standard for every person who's insured in our country. Really what this means is, in the end, we're going to have 36 million people become covered by the time this law is fully implemented in 2014, and those people are going to have some basic guarantees that that coverage that they have will be affordable and will actually be coverage, not like we have now where people are paying obscene amounts of money in the individual market and having almost no real access or coverage. So we've got a clear path forward, and that was good. We had that before the election. Now it's secured. It's been kind of a rough year for the Affordable Care Act, right? We had the Supreme Court decision in June, which put everything to a halt, left us all questioning the future of the law. Fortunately, the law was largely affirmed, got moving again, and then it all came to a grinding halt again as all of a sudden we realized we re-elect people in this country. We have this voting thing that comes up every so often. So we're back to moving again, and that's really what this comes down to. About 2 days before the election, maybe even the day before, Health and Human Services said, hey look, no matter who wins, post-election we're going to issue a slew of rules. This was obviously an attempt to ensure if Mitt Romney did become president that the law would be as implemented as it could be before he took office. And it's a rule, under President Obama, it's just something to get us moving again. We did come to a halt. We had only 13 states that have said they're going to establish an exchange. Those need to be up and running and enrolling people by October. And only 13 states have even said they're going to do it. There's a lot of questions around implementing this that really need to be looked at now. There's a lot of state-federal overlap in these things, so I give a lot of Affordable Care Act presentations. And almost always we end up talking about state Medicaid policy. We talk about state health care access, because you can't have that conversation about the Affordable Care Act without talking about the state. So let's talk about some of the looming threats. We've got the fiscal cliff coming up. This, you know, I think every reporter for, I don't know, the last 3 years, it seems like, was saying election every third or fourth word. The election came, and it was like instantly they forgot the word election and learned the phrase fiscal cliff. It's all anybody's talking about because it has some real implications. Odds are, hopefully, we're not going to fall off that fiscal cliff, but no matter what happens, we are going to have budget discussions, right? And in those budget discussions, for the most part, the Affordable Care Act is protected. Most of this money is kind of sheltered from that process, but there are two big areas where we're concerned. There could be concessions when it comes to the Medicaid expansion. Right now, if states choose to expand Medicaid, that's federally funded, 100% federally funded for the first 2 years. So in Illinois, we're looking at 600,000 people who are going to be added to Medicaid in 2014, and currently the federal government has agreed to pay for all of that. That could change in these fiscal cliff conversations, which could change the reality of having that happen in many states, including Illinois. We have a hard enough time paying for our own Medicaid enrollees. If you add 600,000, it's going to get really tough. There's also a concern about tax credits and subsidies. So as the law is written right now, middle-income Americans, we're talking about like probably almost everybody in this room, is going to qualify for some real support in paying for their health care, between 100 and 400% of the federal poverty level. 400% of the federal poverty level is $92,000 for a family of 4. So many, many people in America are going to qualify for support in the form of tax credits and subsidies as the law is written. We're expecting some real changes to that, or some real threats to that in these fiscal cliff conversations. Then there's state implementation stuff. We need a lot of rules from Health and Human Services. I spend a lot of time saying if and when and maybe and hopefully when I give presentations. We have the general outwork through the law, but it's really time to get into the nitty-gritty. We need to work on developing an exchange in Illinois. Governor Quinn has said we will go forward with a state-federal partnership and exchange in 2014. In 2015, he wants to have a state-based exchange. That's largely the preferred method. We'll see if that actually happens. When we talk about an exchange, it needs to be consumer-friendly. We need to make sure that vulnerable populations are able to really navigate this exchange. We need to have cultural sensitivity. Everyone is going to be beholden to the individual mandate, or just about everybody. That includes people who are not in this system right now, people who are uninsured. We're talking those single adult men. And they don't know that they even qualify for things. Single adult men don't walk around thinking they have health anymore. This is going to be one place that they will, but they need to know that. There's a big education gap. We also have to work on essential health benefits. So we have the general framework laid out, but it's going to be really important to make sure that when we're talking about essential health, that it's actually covered. So we know that mental health services are within those essential health benefits. We need to make sure that's defined in a comprehensive way. We need to make sure that licensed clinical social workers are recognized as physicians or providers who can bill for that and get paid for that, because there's going to be a whole lot of new customers. And finally, we have to look at clinics. We have to look at what we're all doing as social workers. We have to start asking ourselves and our bosses and our colleagues the really important questions around who are we working with? Are we working with those people who are newly eligible for Medicaid? Are we working with the people who need that assistance? What capacity do we have to bring on all these new clients? 600,000 people, you better have a lot of providers. And finally, we have to start doing that internal planning. We have to think about education and outreach and how we're going to comply with this law too, because it affects those people that we work with, but we also have to start providing health insurance for our employers. We have to make all of these changes. So there's a lot for us to think about, and I'm happy to talk about this some more.
Thank you. Joel, bring us to state perspective.
Okay. Thank you. It's always advantageous to go last, because then you find out what everyone else had to say, and change your whole presentation. No, I'm just kidding. First of all, I want to thank the panelists, and I also really want to thank Professor Simpson. I've been sort of an admirer of your career back in the day when I cut my teeth in politics and worked my first election as a senior in high school working for Abner Mikva, who was also back in the day, an independent Democrat. I want to thank you for being here. I was very honored when you responded to my email and said, yes, I'd be able to participate in this, so thank you. I'm going to really try to focus a little bit more on how the social work perspective in mobilizing people to get out and work in elections and how that process goes, and then talk a little bit about sort of the implications of what Professor Simpson said about the supermajorities now in the Illinois House and the supermajorities in the Illinois Senate, and what that all means. First of all, many of you do, or maybe you don't know, the social work profession has a political action committee. NASW, who I work for during the day and most other times during the week, has a separately incorporated political action committee that endorses candidates, that gives money to candidates, and every election cycle we have a very, very rigorous endorsement process, which is based on a questionnaire and also based on looking at a scorecard, a legislative scorecard of elected officials. And so, based on that, we make endorsements. And based on that, and we don't obviously endorse in every race. We have a variety of criteria, and the people who make these decisions on the PAC are not just me and a couple people in a smoke-filled room, where other decisions are made in Illinois usually. Well, no longer smoke-filled rooms. We don't have those anymore, right? So. But those we review those and take those recommendations very, very seriously, and then try to mobilize social workers, sort of picking up on what Mark was saying, to get out involved in the process. And I got to be very honest with you that, and I've been with NASW for a long time, 13 years. And I find it very, very disheartening that we don't have enough social workers getting involved in the political process, even though we are obligated in our code of ethics to get involved. I was thinking of Mark's presentation. I was thinking about the rank and filers during the New Deal effort, who were actually opposed to a lot of the New Deal programs that President Roosevelt was promoting, feeling that they didn't go far enough. But it is. I'd be remiss not to mention that, to say that it is. We need to do a lot more work in getting people out. And I got to tell you, we and some of you get very annoying emails from us about getting out and working in elections, but we don't have enough people to get out and walk precincts. And I got to tell you, it's probably the most empowering thing to do, even if you just to go to work on an election day. Sort of picking up on what Professor Simpson was about this significant growth in the Latino vote. I was actually worked for one of our endorsed candidates on election day. I was canvassing for Elaine Nekritz, who's been in the State House for, I don't know, probably about 8 or 10 years. And her district was redistricted, and obviously part of the results that Professor Simpson mentioned were impacted by a favorable remap of the state of Illinois that was controlled by the Democratic Party. But her district now extends into an area that I wasn't even aware of. And I was canvassing an area in Palatine, Illinois, and I had no idea that there were significant areas in Palatine where probably every single house I went to, English was not their first language, and Spanish was. So it was really this incredible experience. So I guess what I'm saying about this is that, one of the byproducts of tonight is saying, social workers, we got to get more involved in the political process, okay? We may be involved nationally in some ways, but we got to really get involved on the ground and get involved in campaigns and help volunteering. So saying that, and I'm not going to reiterate what Professor Simpson said about some of the numbers and what's going on in the supermajorities in the Illinois House and the Illinois Senate. But the question is now, what does Mike Madigan and what does Senator Colton do with that power? And obviously, some of the bigger issues that impact us, first and foremost, obviously, is the human services budget. There is talk right now, as Professor Simpson did mention, of extending actually or making permanent the tax increase that was passed in 2011 during the lame duck session. It was down in Springfield that wild week it was a week where the tax increase was passed, and we also that's when the moratorium, the death penalty moratorium was, or we made law opposing the death penalty here in Illinois. So that's a huge issue. Part of the other bigger issue that I think many human service advocates are hoping with this newfound power is that we finally come around to solving this problem of paying providers. Many of the agencies that you may work for. We have an incredibly severe problem in this state of basically providers providing their services for free, because we don't get paid from the state, or even, the promises of the state to pay you in 60 or 90 or 120 days. It's essentially like providing services for free. So that's another huge issue that that I think hopefully the enhanced Democratic majorities in both chambers will hopefully use that power to figure that out. I think one of the other things also is that Illinois, picking up what Kathy was saying, Illinois has been really a leader in moving the Affordable Care Act along, I think that is pretty much assured now that we're going to get things moving with our exchange program here. And although we've had some setbacks here in Medicaid with a almost $3 billion cut in Medicaid that took place this past May, we got a lot of work to do in that area as well. Those are sort of the bigger looming issues that I think hopefully the majorities in both the Illinois Senate and the Illinois House will they'll be used for good measure. One last thing, just a general comment on, where does this leave the Republican Party here in Illinois? And our political action committee endorses Republicans as well. There are people that support our issues that are not always aligned with the Democratic Party. As I think that they probably need to really take a step back, as they are nationally, to really say what's going on and where are we heading in this issue. I think there will probably be some major changes in the leadership in both the Republican leadership in the House, that meaning Tom Cross, and the Republican leadership in the Senate, which is the Senate Republican leader the Senate Republican leader is Senator Christine Radogno. Many of you, or maybe you don't know, is a social worker. She's a graduate at Loyola University. Interesting enough, the social work profession used to really work with her on a lot of things. Unfortunately, a lot of her votes have skewed towards votes that are not in the interest of the social work profession. So that'll be an interesting thing to watch as well. So I just wanted to add that perspective, and just again put in a real plug that come the 2014 elections, we really need more social workers involved in the process. Thanks.
I think we should give a round of applause for all of our panelists. And so I'm sure that where's our banner white with questions, we've been collecting a number of questions, and this is a good opportunity to the first question is for Mark, but I want to say if anybody wants to jump in, we'll direct this one to you, but feel free to help your colleague out. And let me make sure that I can read. We have similar questions, and so, Nicole, is the first one kind of encompassing both?
The obvious one kind of come out.
Okay.
I think those are both.
Okay, Mark, it says that you mentioned the players involved in a necessary new progressive movement to address the very serious social problems and political issues. Can you say more about that, about the movement, and ideally what you would like to see happen?
Sure. There are probably three things that I think would be crucial if we were going to build the kind of new progressive movement that I'm talking about. One of them is, individually, we need to be ready to speak the truth. We have many opportunities to speak the truth, and many opportunities to let stuff go. And we by ourselves cannot change the problems that we've been talking about. We need, truly, there's some wonderful research that says in order to make a major change in a society, you need a very high level of participation, which means we need to bring a lot of folks along. We don't need everybody to be on the streets. We may need some, but we need a lot of people to be ready to vote, for example, once a movement has gotten us there. And that's only going to happen if we're talking about these problems all the time and not just going with the flow of our friends and our families and our co-workers and so forth. The problems are serious, and I think we have to keep saying the problems are serious. The second thing I think we need to do is, and this is what organizing is all about, we have to have organizations that focus on these things. And that includes the organizations we've already got, like NASW, of which I've been a member since 1976 or something like that. Yeah, I know, I'm getting old, aren't I? That includes those organizations, but it also includes organizations that would encompass the multiple groups that I'm talking about, that bring social workers and public health folks and activists and community members and artists. We've really got to work with artists, and artists can go either way, but there's so much that arts can do. And when I say arts, I mean, sure, visual arts, I mean film, I mean music, I mean the whole range, theater, all of those kinds of things. People who are going to keep putting the issues out there so that they don't keep disappearing, because they're hard, and they're going to keep disappearing unless we're putting them out there. So building that kind of coalition. And ultimately, we need to have a significant part of the population that recognize that part of what they have to do is be a culture of resistance to corporate capitalism. That's a harder one to sell. It's not the first place that you would start to try to convince your mother or your brother or something. But ultimately, we've got to find ways to resist that, to not slip into consumer culture, not slip into the endless growth approach. There's a wonderful man lives in a cabin outside Edmonton, Alberta, named Lyle Grant. I recommend you do a search for Lyle Grant's articles. He's got ways, he's worked on ways, very hard worked on ways to convince people that a sustainable life can be more fun. Because we can't just say, just stop buying, stop using. People don't like to make sacrifices. So we've got to reframe it in a different kind of way. And that can be done, I think.
Questions? Okay, they told me to stay near the mic. Okay. And so I can read, so hopefully you all will continue to write legibly for these old eyes. This is to the panel. Can you talk about federal and state policy? I'm trying to read it first, okay. Can you talk about federal and state policy that will have a negative impact on social services? How will this impact the future of social work? Where does social work fit?
I can just make one comment that I think the other panelists have already said in different ways. The first major area that will have the greatest impact has to do with budgets. You know, any governing body, particularly legislators, do three things. They pass laws, you know, you can only go 30 miles an hour in the speed limit zone. They approve appointments, that is, and locally it's people like the police superintendent or whatever, the boards. Nationally it's more important, like Secretary of State or whoever that are carrying out the different policies. And they do the budgets. And a lot of what matters in government is what's in the budget. And most often they're demands that you cut the budget this way versus cutting it that way are really important. And it's particularly important at this stage because of the national deficit and the Illinois debt is so large that this isn't a time of affluence when you can just sort of say, well, I'll give you social work programs and I'll give you defense programs and I'll give her, you know, women's rights programs. There's plenty of money, don't worry about it. I remember the times in the 60s and 70s when we didn't really worry too much about budgets because there was enough money. You know, this university got built overnight, relatively speaking, in the 60s. We didn't worry about whether we were going to have a university. We had one. It got built. Well, that isn't this kind of time period. And so in a time of difficult choices, when you're choosing between doing one thing or the other, voices really matter. And most of the time, people who most need social services are usually in the weakest position to demand them, and their allies, like all of you, are often not really using the political tools very well to ensure that you're speaking, forcing, requiring things to go that way. So budget battles are not going to, they're going to be detailed, but they're not going to be subtle. And if you're not a part of that battle, you're going to be sorry about the social services that result.
I just want to add to Professor Simpson's comments about that. I think that is probably the major negative as far as how it's going to impact the profession. I think one of the things that we also have to do a better job of is we need to be able to frame our positions in a lot better way, instead of you know, sort of in the more affluent times, if there have ever been an affluent time in human service history, but a little bit more affluent than today. But we have to frame our argument a lot different, as far as not always coming to say we need more money, but coming and saying, here is what our interventions and outcome measures, and this is what we do and how it works. Because it's firstly competitive. We also need to be very proud of the industry we represent, and we are an industry. We're a huge, I know you may not like that word industry, but we're a huge industry. And we represent a significant number of jobs in the state of Illinois, and we represent people who work at every single state senate and every single state representative district in the state. So we have to learn how to put things in those terms, so a legislator can understand that a little bit better in this really fiercely competitive. And as Professor Simpson said, this will not be a subtle time in the next year or two.
And you know, one of the things you framed earlier is you're not always necessarily just asking for more money. You were saying earlier that, well, if we could just get the state to pay its bills on time, that would make a difference for our clients. Well, that's something you can sell. I mean, all we have to do is borrow $5 billion or so as a state. You know, it's counter to normal financial thinking to borrow for operating costs and blah-de-de-blah-de-de. It doesn't matter. As the old Mayor Daley used to say, usually when I was being defeated 47-3, have you got the votes? Well, we had an election. We had the votes. Use them.
And I would add, from a healthcare perspective, I mean, again, it's been said time and again, and the budget really is going to be a big issue. At the state level, where we really see a need for social workers is for amplifying those voices, empowering communities to speak out, getting communities engaged, being engaged as social workers ourselves. You know, to be very concrete and kind of get into the weeds about this, when the state made those outrageous cuts to Medicaid at the end of last session, they assumed a lot of savings that aren't going to be realized. So we've already started having the conversations amongst advocates that we've had 2 years of pretty significant Medicaid reform in a row, and we're looking at a third. And all that's really left for that are changes to eligibility for children and optional services for adults. In Illinois, we're pretty generous with our mental health services, as far as Medicaid goes at least. That could be at real risk. Undocumented children could lose coverage in all kids, and we need to get those people out there because, right, these are the marginalized communities that aren't being heard, and we really have a role as social workers. I was never cut out for direct practice social work, so it's easy for me to come up here and just say we need to get these people speaking, because that was always the route I was going to take. We also, I think, not necessarily a challenge, but a place that social workers really need to be thinking as healthcare delivery professionals is, how do we fit into where this country is going? Because we saw it with Medicaid reform the last 2 years, we're seeing it with health reform. There is a real push towards coordinated care. And social workers are providing a health service in mental health and behavioral health. And if we're not quick to tap into some of those networks, we're going to get lost, because coordinated care means referrals, referrals from your medical home, so you need to be connected to those larger networks. It's not necessarily going to be a bad thing for service delivery, but it is a pretty big shift, and it has a big implication for social workers and school-based health centers, which are another important resource to kind of go off track.
Kind of as a follow-up question to that, put your crystal ball hats on. What are 2 reasonable and effective policy changes to address our budget deficit in Illinois?
Well, Well, I mentioned one that's absolutely essential, and that's continuing the income tax. If that doesn't happen, I can't tell you how, I can tell you where to go for the report. The Institute for Government and Public Affairs issued a report 2 weeks ago, national report on Illinois, and essentially it said if we don't continue the existing level of income tax in Illinois and refrain from vast new spending, that is, keep it at about 2% a year in this level of the economy, while the economy recovers, we're in for total disaster that would make what we've already been through look like, just a mild occasion and not a problem. So one change that we need is to make the income tax permanent. That's very unpopular. You and I pay more taxes, right? And yes, that's what it means. Or paying the same amount as we're paying, but not paying less. That's a very important policy. It has a direct effect on probably every program you care about. So if you had to choose just one thing to do, I would say making the income tax permanent is the first order of business, because although it would work against Mark's idea of letting everything get much worse so we'd get a reaction.
I just think that's going to happen. I don't want it to happen.
I'd just as soon not have it get worse to try and figure out how to do the politics right.
Yeah, I'm going to really support that. And this is one of those cases around telling the truth, because 5% income tax is not a high rate. When I lived in New York State, I was paying 8.5. New Mexico, which is a poor state, pays about 5.5. Wisconsin, I think I was paying about 5.8. And 3% was ridiculous. And you cannot run a state on 3% income tax. And 5% is a bargain. So I think as we're saying, this is important in order to provide the services that we need to provide. A piece of that also is to say, we're paying quite low rates for a state that is as complex and as large as ours is.
Okay, our next question, and I think, Mark, this is probably in your area. I'm going to try to summarize. We had 3 questions, and it seems that this group has been inspired by wanting to find ways to get involved. And the comments range from our dysfunctional political system, that people are concerned that it seems that a lot of our political leaders have more self-interest in front of the people's interests, and so how to get involved. So I guess the question would be, where do you start? Where do you start? What can they walk out of the room with today in terms of what can we do to start this whole progressive movement process?
All right.
Didn't mean to put you on the spot.
No, I have too many thoughts at the same time. One of the things that I think is really easy is now, right after the election, and I have a lot of experience doing this in several different states. Now, right after the election, is the time for you to go talk to the people that you have elected, talk to their staff, build those relationships. I don't think it's going to be as effective if we present as this is important for social work. We have to be really careful about this self-interest kind of notion, because every group goes in and says we need more money for what we do. But this is a time when we can go in and talk about people, talk about some of the issues that we're already talking about, but also some of the ones that I raised. Do it together. A small organizing effort of 5 of you going somewhere can have a profound impact. You can build relationships now before all the votes start and so forth. And it's those, social work's about relationships, right? And that's a crucial piece of this. I think also that could be NESW, could be something that Emily starts, whatever. Start to bring some folks together from some of the other groups that I've talked about around an issue. If there's something that you really care about, go to some public health folks, go to some artists, go to some activists, and try to figure out a few action steps that you can take, that this stuff can build over time. Reach out to the people who were involved in the Occupy movement, many of whom are very young folks with a lot of commitment that don't know exactly what to do at this point. And because Obama won the election, so now what are we supposed to do? I also think that it's at least worth having, some of the others will not like this, I'm sure, but that's okay. So at least worth having some conversation with some of the Green Party people. And just think about what would happen if we had 10% of the, maybe 20% of the state legislators that were Green Party. The Democrats who run everything, and Mike Madigan runs everything, this is practically a dictatorship in many ways. If they had to, this is something that happens in Europe all the time. It's the problem with the two-party system where one party is so weak. Madigan makes the decisions. If there was a significant number of folks in the state legislature who were in a progressive party of some kind, I think the Green Party is pretty damn close to right on most things, which is why I'm suggesting that, but some kind of progressive party that had some votes, they then have leverage. So those are some places to start. I could give you more, but.
There are two things that politics involves. One is winning elections, and the other is passing and controlling legislation. And so you need to, doing something individually, like I don't even encourage my students to write a congressman or that kind of stuff that you learn in civics class, because it doesn't work, is the short reason not to do that. I mean, yes, please do, but it won't matter. What does matter is a group. And so you need to join groups that are trying to pass legislation or groups that are trying to win elections. And those can be like the Green Party. If you don't want to join that kind of group, join a group like IVIPO, Independent Voters of Illinois, Independent Precinct Organization, or join the Democrats or the Republicans, or some branch of it. You know, a lot of the Democrats, for instance, that began to create the party in DuPage County are more like the Green Party than they are like the old patronage wards or Dick Mell or somebody in Chicago. So find a group that wants to do something about elections. Find a group that wants to pass some kind of elections, because politics is a craft. It's like being a carpenter or a plumber. Doesn't matter what your education degree is. Do you know the mechanics of winning a successful election, whether you win or not, but being winnable? And do you know the craft of getting somebody to pass legislation you care about? If you don't know the craft and no other social worker knows the craft, you're in trouble, because somebody else does know the craft already, and they're probably not the people you want causing the elections to be won and causing the laws to be passed. So somebody among you, like NASW with both its PAC and its lobbying effort, somebody among you has to learn the craft. If there are no plumbers and no carpenters, there's going to be no house. So some part of you are going to have to give time and effort to learning the craft of politics and then applying it in the way you want towards the goals you want.
It's all about process in our profession, and the political arena is process, and you have to understand, as Professor Susan said, and I think that's what, and during my introductory comments in the panelist part of the evening, I was sort of complaining about the fact that we don't have enough social workers that will do that. Will go in a group to meet with a senator or a representative in their district. I got to tell you something. You're a voter. You're a constituent. You have power. Your vote and some of the other people you go with all have the power to keep that person's job across the table or take that person's job away. That's a very, very empowering message. And I know it may seem contrite because small numbers, what does it matter? But there's something to be said when you get in front of a legislator, talk about your area of expertise. You know what? They may remember that the next time they see a piece of legislation come across their desk about mental health, about autism, about whatever, that they may be calling you for your expertise to talk about something, perhaps even testify about a particular bill. So you should never underestimate that as well.
Okay, switching gears. The original Affordable Care Act provided coverage for low-income individuals by expanding Medicaid eligibility from 100 to 133% of the federal level. Expansion of Medicaid was struck down by the Supreme Court. As a result, states can now voluntarily adopt expansion, but are not required to do so. The government cannot punish states that refuse to expand their Medicaid programs by withdrawing federal funds. Will this likely mean many Americans will remain without health coverage?
So that's a great question, and I think first it's important to say that the Supreme Court did not strike down the Medicaid expansion. Basically what they said was the system wasn't voluntary enough, right? Every state enters into Medicaid voluntarily, or did when the law first, or when the program was first brought into existence. And when the program was first brought into existence and everybody agreed to do this, they agreed to do it for 5 categories of people. So when the law was written, it said either you expand or you lose all of your funding. And the Supreme Court said, hey, look, Medicaid funding is about 10% of most state budgets, and there's no way they could have anticipated 5 categories of people turning into all categories of people. So it wasn't struck down, but it was made voluntary. So that really great incentive of losing all Medicaid funding was just not, it was found to be federal coercion, and it can't go forward that way. So states may gain new funding, but they're not going to lose existing funding if they choose not to participate. So what this turns into is a number of states have said, we are not going to move forward with the expansion. A lot of this was political posturing. We also had a lot of states saying they're not doing an exchange, but you better believe after the election, today was the day actually that states had to signal their intent to the federal government to move forward with an exchange. They have to have their blueprint in by February 16th. And out of the woodwork came Florida and Arizona with their exchanges. Jan Brewer was working on this for many months. It's largely, the ACA has been a political football, and every part of it has been a political football. Now that we know it's here, we think that's going to change a little bit. We think that within a few years of implementation, every single state is going to have expanded Medicaid, and there's a few reasons for that. One, states lose so much money on uncompensated care. When people are uninsured, you all know, they don't stay healthy. They eventually do get sick. They wait until they're as sick as they can possibly stand. They go to the emergency room. They can't pay in the emergency room. And then those costs don't just disappear. They fall back on individuals who are insured, other individuals who are accessing health care, and they certainly fall back as charitable care on taxpayers and on the state. So there's an incentive just to insure people to avoid that problem. More importantly, there is a huge financial incentive. So I talked a little bit about this, but in the first 2 years of the expansion, so 2014 and 2015, the federal government is funding that Medicaid expansion at 100%. For states like Illinois, I mean, we've already said, Governor Quinn has already said in Illinois we're moving forward. He said that in front of news cameras, not legislatively, but it's a start. In Illinois, we can't afford to not have that money, and that's the position many states are in as well. After the first 2 years, the federal funding decreases some. It goes down to 90% by 2020. This isn't a match, this is funding. So we think that that's a pretty big carrot. We saw similar hesitation or resistance when the Children's Health Insurance Program was expanded. A lot of states said, we're absolutely not doing this, we can't afford it. Every single state participates in CHIP at this point. So I think we're going to see a lot of that political posturing is going to die off, certainly not all of it. We're going to lose those repeal votes, which is good because there were something like 50 votes to repeal the Affordable Care Act in Congress. But I think we're going to see Medicaid move forward. We're certainly working in Illinois to ensure that it moves forward. But I think pretty quickly we'll see all states jumping on board.
Thank you. To the panel, what shift do you anticipate at the national level in immigration policy and enforcement in both Democrats and Republicans, in light of the youth and Latino votes, and now with the upcoming election cycles?
Well, I'm hoping that we eventually pass the DREAM Act in this country. That's a first start. And I think also that the President now has to respond to the large number of Latino votes that he received and move forward on a lot of these things. I think there's no going back, and I actually think the Republican Party is probably going to begin to change their formal policies. You know, the Jan Brewers of the world and others are probably going to have to start looking at this and realize that there are, you know, that this is reality. But I think I'm hoping there'll be another push to pass the DREAM Act. And we failed, unfortunately, 2 years ago. But that's where I think, that's, at least from my perspective, I think will hopefully happen.
I think all of that is right. I think the Immigration Act that comes out may not be exactly an ideal one. The compromise will have to happen. But probably the biggest thing that will have to happen first is to probably find ways to water down or curb the filibuster in the Senate, because at the moment any single senator could block it by simply saying he probably would filibuster. He wouldn't have to filibuster. He wouldn't have to do anything except say he would. And I don't think that's likely to continue to be the exact way. Once that's broken through, then I think there will be an Immigration Act. I think the DREAM Act is the easiest to pass. I think any other Immigration Act will have a lot of stuff about guarding the borders and that kind of stuff, very heavy in the language, and whether it'll have a true path to citizenship, I think, is more in doubt and at the moment. But I think it will move forward. It has to move forward, and the political side is on the side of major reform over time.
Yeah, I think even Bobby Jindal, I think it was yesterday, might have been the day before, who's a player in the Republican Party, plans to run for president clearly at some point. He said we have to stop being a stupid party, and that's the words that he used. And in part what he was talking about, a significant part of what he was talking about, was we can't just keep distancing ourselves from the largest growing voting bloc in the country. And we need Latinos, and his perspective is Latinos belong with us anyway, because they're very interested in entrepreneurship and they're hardworking folks and so forth, and we got to bring them in. Now, in order to make that work, there's got to be something around immigration reform. I'm with Dick, I think, concerned that it's not going to be a dramatic and tremendously progressive kind of policy, but something is going to happen. The DREAM Act, I think, is easy, and it's almost everybody is now saying now that the election is over, yeah, we better just support something like this. But we just need to make some small changes, is what I'm hearing from Republicans. So,
our final question, this has been quite an enjoyable evening, but we must bring closure, and so our final question to the panel is, according to the Affordable Care Act, health plans must cover preventative care and chronic illnesses. One of the biggest concerns is there may not be an adequate pool of primary care providers to serve this predicted 30 to 40 million new enrollees coming into the healthcare market in 2014. Might this mean that there will not be easy access to care for all and equal access and quality of care for all?
All right. This is probably my least favorite question to answer. Whenever I meet with a group of social service agencies or healthcare agencies and I say 600,000 newly eligible for Medicaid, everybody goes, it's a scary proposition, right? So this law gets at that to some extent, because, right, this is the Affordable Care Act, but it's also about access. We need to make healthcare affordable, but if everybody's insured in an affordable way, it means nothing if we can't go to a doctor, and that's true for private insurance and public insurance. We We've always had the provider shortage in Medicaid. I think there is new fear of a provider shortage for those of us who are not enrolled in Medicaid, and there's a few things we're doing at that. So when it comes to Medicaid, there are new incentives for primary care providers to begin accepting Medicaid, right? That's the reason we don't have enough providers in Medicaid, because nobody wants to deal with that. You don't get paid enough, you don't get paid on time, it's not worth it. No matter what your intent may be. So this law actually in the first 2 years provides an increased reimbursement. So primary care providers, defined as primary care providers, family care physicians, internists, and pediatricians providing primary care, will be paid at the Medicare rate instead of the Medicaid rate for 2 years. So that's going to be a big incentive, right? I mean, Medicare providers get paid a hell of a lot more than Medicaid providers. So that's something that we think will bring a lot more providers in when it comes to public health. It also has some implications for social workers, for school health centers, for some of these non-MDs, because we are providing primary care. So this is something we're exploring, what the implications will be, and if you all can start billing Medicaid at the Medicare rate, which would be fantastic. We need some more guidance on this. This is a very common refrain when we talk about the ACA. We'll find out what happens. There are also provisions built in around the education and incentivizing of people to even go into primary care. The reason we don't have enough primary care physicians is because anesthesiologists get paid $600,000 a year. Primary care providers do not get that. So there are programs designed to entice students into primary care by forgiving their student loans. We already have the public service loan forgiveness, which as social workers I hope you're all familiar with. If you're not, Google it, because it's going to save you a lot of money. That will be expanded upon for primary care providers. If you go into this specialty, you are going to have help paying for your student loans to counter the fact that you're not going to be making $600,000 a year. We're also expecting a sort of organic growth, right? This isn't written into the law, but it's something that can be logically inferred. If you're going to have 40 million people who become insured, everybody's going to have the opportunity for a lot more patients. So everybody is going to see a lot more dollar signs when they look at this. Health insurance companies love this law because they're making money. Providers should love this law for the same reason, if not for their love of people. It's a real concern, and it's a concern that is not new, but I think that this law is getting us closer than we have in the past to fixing the problem. And we should expect really the bigger concern is going to be amongst those on public programs, because when it comes to private insurance, I think we're all going to find ourselves feeling pretty secure.
Thank you. And again, I want to thank our panelists. Let's give them another round of applause. So I want to thank all of you all for coming, and also to do a little announcement that we will be planning a spring event. Now that the committee has begun to work, and I think we can say without waiting for evaluations, which we aren't doing today, that this has been a success. We will be working to bring you another opportunity on some pertinent issues to the field. So with that, Nicole?
I could probably talk loud enough. You know, could you guys, did everybody sign in? When you signed in, did you have to write an email address when you signed in?
No, I didn't even.
Yes, no? Okay. I forgot to mention about the CEU forms. Are most of you getting CEUs today? If you fill in the information, it says on here $5. You do not need to get $5. The CEUs are free. The other thing, you don't need to have your license number when you fill this out. Leave this with us today, and you'll receive a certificate in the mail saying that you attended for your CEUs. If you wouldn't mind adding your email address onto this form, so that we could email evaluation form out, we would appreciate that. And did everybody put their card or information in here that would like to be put in for the drawing? Anybody else? Okay. Kathy, would you like to pull out the winner?
Yes.
Oh, one more.
The suspense is killing me.
Anyone figure out which parking ticket this is? So you can embarrass you if you come to the front.
Just make sure it's not mine.
That's what I'm thinking.
Does anyone need a CEU form?
Oh, really? I didn't know. Thanks, Mark. Thank you for participating. Nice to see you, too.
Yeah, the drawing. I'll pick up part. Anyone else need a CEU form?
CCU stuff.
Yeah.
Kathy has been involved in some of these discussions, like the Medicaid stuff. I was blocks in my face. She wanted to talk about
Yeah.
the other favorites of mine.
Judy's going to stand on the way out.
Since 2011.
Okay.
I was 2011. I started Monday after graduation. I was so yeah. I was ready to go. I was on top of it. The last thing I wanted was to sit around and just wait. So I mean, I was lucky. I wanted to work in Ocean's Health.
Yeah, it's not going to be. I think,
first job
I think like with any policy change in the front end, it'll be a problem with physicians, but the market is going to.
Going to get them.
Oh, you know that. Think about it. Think about it. Just think about it. Yeah,
We've got Carrie Curran.
yeah, you know, 'cause people are going to go to school, and it's going to be a big incentive not only knowing that you're going to have the clients and then the loan.
Again, thank you.
Does that have parking ticket too?
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
Thank you very much. And your CEUs.
Are you guys providing some sort of